Okay, in this conversation, we are going to continue to talk about the conversation of evangelism. And evangelism is one of those things where you can't just talk about it once or do a series on it. It represents an ongoing conversation. This is also representative of a new series that I'm doing. I know I'm always doing new stuff, whether it's, making the connection or whether it's off the record. I'm going to be featuring different folks in my Patreon community who are on the healing team, biblical literacy team. Sam is on the biblical literacy team, and he is brilliant. And I actually don't say that lightly, and I don't say that about many people. But he's someone who has actually done some stuff on the biblical literacy team in terms of presenting. And I just had to take what he has done in terms of his hard work, and I wanted to feature it because I really think that it unearths and clarifies a couple of really important things that are confusing. So without further ado, Sam Youngblood, welcome to the channel, my brother.
Thanks for the introduction, Kyle. I appreciate it a lot, man. Yeah, it's a lot of fun to be here, and I'm glad that we were able to put together this biblical literacy team, or as we lovingly call it, the BLT.
That's right.
To try to think through some different issues and just talk about how we can be more biblically literate as a community. So, yeah, it's great to be here.
Absolutely. And if you're interested and you're watching this and, oh, what's this biblical literacy team? What's the healing team? It's about finding people who want to be active in their teaching gifts or their healing gifts. And so you do have to be a Patreon member to be considered to be on one of those teams. So if you're interested, come to Patreon and we can get you some more information. Okay. So Sam, what's your first kind of thought here?
Yeah, so kind of exploring how we narrow God's mission as we understand it. I think the first observation I had was that we can exalt the Great Commission, in quotes.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that is that, of course, the Great Commission is these, you could say it's those last five verses at the end of Matthew that are entitled the Great Commission. As you see in the NIV or a lot of our modern day translations, when you open up a Bible, it has those little section headers and it'll say up there, the Great Commission, right? And I think that what happens is that we see a title like that, it's great, and it talks about this commission, this mission that we're on, partnering with God and what He's doing, and it can seem like okay, what I'm reading now is of an elevated status. What I'm about to engage with is something that is it's head and shoulders above other things that I've been reading, right?
Hmm.
And I think that whenever that's the case, rhetorically, that seems to give it more weight than some of these other essential commands and teachings that Jesus had. I think that Christopher J.H. Wright, in The Great Story and The Great Commission, he correctly observes that there are so many more other commands and commissions given to the disciples, but in recent times, particularly in the last couple of centuries and in our current time, this passage has seemingly been elevated among a lot of the other commands and teachings that Jesus has for his disciples. I also read that in Transforming Mission by David Bosch, he discusses how the rise of the social gospel has seemed to be a threat against evangelism. And so in response to that, there was kind of this growth to emphasize, okay, well, what can we find in the scriptures to combat this different language and practice being done in churches that's so much more focused on involvement in the political realm and that kind of social stirring of the world, which was deeply involved with a lot of the civil rights movement and the abolition of slavery, things of that nature. And so there became kind of this push to find what evidence can get us focused back to the topic of saving souls and getting focused on that. And we got, in a sense, that was kind of a reactionary point to go back to, okay, we need to emphasize the Great Commission. And I think something that we need to realize with this too, as we just talk about what is God's mission and narrowing it, is that mission itself is not a word that has biblical origin. You won't find mission just explicitly said in the Bible, but we're postulating God's mission as a work of our own theology, as we're trying to put into words, okay, well, what is God doing across the scriptures? Or what has he called humanity to do? This is something that we're piecing together from what's there in the scriptures rather than it just explicitly using the word mission at points in time. So I think to dive a little bit further into, I've been talking about how the Great Commission is a title. I think it has to be noted that when you read the NIV or the NLT or these different translations of the text as it is nowadays, and you see these different titles, that this isn't how the Bible was originally written. When you go back to the Greek, they don't have these section headers at the top of the verses or chapters or any of those things. Even chapters and verses themselves were later invention. It wasn't until Archbishop Stephen Langston actually created our chapter system in the 13th century. And then in the 16th century, French scholar Robert Estinier added verses. So, these later ways to reference the text didn't come into a much later point. And even later after that, do we actually get to the point where we're dividing up the scriptures in terms of these different titles that were assigned to it. So Hudson Taylor popularized the phrase the Great Commission in a lot of his preaching and mission work in the late 19th century. And then we see in the Schofield Reference Bible, which was largely popular among premillennial dispensationalist movements in the late 19th century, we see that title, the Great Commission, get applied to those verses and inserted in that study Bible. And that became the most prominent source of where that phrase came from and where it started to establish its dominance in Western evangelicalism as we know it. I think it's important to note that background via those different parachurch ministries, via the rise of premillennial dispensationalism. That really, again, like I was just saying before, it's arising during this time that the Christian life is being envisioned as salvation from this world. That's trying to separate discipleship from social engagement because there's a lot of discomforting things happening to some of the Christians in the West or the evangelical movement as they're dealing with the rise of civil rights and things like that. There was some negative reactions to those things that spurred people to want to detach from this reality or this world in their discipleship and grew into this how do we push to make the mission more focused on saving souls rather than what is it doing to impact things in this world and this life. So do you have any questions so far, or would you like me to keep going?
This makes so much sense. I in some ways, what I'm hearing you say is that there are cultural and societal factors that have created this particular emphasis.
Totally, yeah, which is exactly where I was going to go to next, which is that really our emphasis on the Great Commission and these last few verses of Matthew 28 that's a novel feature of Christianity. That's something that's new to us and a new move. Historically, the early church, which in our movement, we look so readily to restore the early church, and we think about how can we imitate or renew what they were doing back then. And they did grow. We can't observe that they did grow, but they didn't use Matthew 28 as a driving text for them about going out and making disciples. And we've got to focus on multiplying and exponential growth. That was not something that they did. If they did mention those verses there at the end of Matthew's gospel, it was typically for the purpose of their Trinitarian theology. Talking about being baptized in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And for also just understanding the value of baptism as well. And so that was what they mainly focused on that text for, rather than saying, hey, this is for us, we need to do exactly what Jesus commissioned them. Actually, a lot of them saw Matthew 28 as already having been fulfilled, that the apostles went to all the corners of the earth as they knew it at the time, and had spread the mission, the gospel to those people. They had proclaimed it to all the Gentiles outside of Israel and the Jews. And so to some of those early Christians, they looked at it as if this was complete. So our job is something different. It may stream out of that, but they didn't take on that task from those verses and claim that for themselves.
Let me play devil's advocate. And I remember when I studied the Bible, the kind of the premise or the emphasis around these are Jesus's last words. And so I remember when I was studying the Bible, how this was portrayed to me was, now Kyle, if you think about the last thing you're going to say before you leave this earth, I want you to think, is it, you think it's important? Whatever you say, if these are your last words, how important do you think those are? And so that's how this was introduced to me. which is this is the last statement that Jesus makes before he goes to heaven. And so this idea of going to all nations, baptizing, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded was of ultimate importance. In other words, this sort of, we take a snapshot of what he says, and then now that becomes programmatic. So if you could just for a moment before we move on, because I think context really matters. Without context, it leads to pretext, right? Um, if you could just break down, per your perspective, when Jesus is talking to his disciples, okay, help us to understand a little bit of the context of that moment.
Yeah. So I think firstly, just to kind of take head on, that kind of approach, we want to, okay, Jesus' final words, you want the words, before you go or leave other people to be really impactful. I think there is some of that rhetorical value to Matthew, but I think the first, those earlier Christians, they would have thought of that as important, but not as important in the sense of it's important that he said that so we can take it on and we can, do that ourselves. So they think of it as important as, this is a very vital stage in what God's plan is in the world, that he's entasking his apostles to go out to the nations and to bring this, the good news of God's kingdom to more people than just the Jews, to bring it to all the nations. That's a huge transition for them. And I think that's, points the wider context of what's going on in Matthew. I mean, that's just a huge theme of Jesus' ministry throughout, is it's all about, going back to the beginning of his ministry, what is he doing? He's going out and preaching about God's kingdom. God's kingdom is here, and that reign is so central to what is going on in Matthew. And it's so much wider than just the essence of, okay, well, we've got to win more converts, but it's about how do you expand the reign of God's kingdom into every facet of people's lives. I mean, that's why you have, Jesus, of course, in the Sermon on the Mount, all those different teachings are so focused on how we're treating other human beings and all the different ethical dimensions of life. And he's really trying to get people to think more than just, okay, do you agree with these ideas? But it is very much about the actual kind of life that is being lived as a result of that. And I think even as you read the Great Commission, if you read it in context, you see those echoes, not only of Matthew, but of Scripture as a whole, right? Because it opens with Jesus saying, I have been given all authority on heaven and in earth. That's pointing to his kingship. That's pointing to him as this anointed one that, we see in Isaiah, this person who's bringing the good news of God's kingdom, who's accompanying God's returning reign to the earth to establish a place where his will is being done on earth as it is in heaven, and he's calling people to be his disciples, to do and take on such a task, right? And then it also concludes as well with Jesus talking about how he will be with them to the very end of the age, which is pointing to the end, to the idea of whenever everything is culminated and brought together. So when you read these verses, not just talking about this task of going and making disciples, but it's pointing to the broad narrative of what God is doing, from creation and charging human beings to bear his image and establish his reign and rule over creation, to the end whenever it's restoring things, restoring God's rule, and putting human beings back in the place where they need to be, of reflecting God as they should, instead of doing things about on their own terms.
Question about the premillennial dispensationalism.
Yeah.
Is this where some people at an eschatological level, eschatological means like end times, is this where some people kind of do this interpretive dance where they say, if we evangelize the world, or if we baptize and we convert the world, it will usher in this new millennial kingdom?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, there's this kind of conditional thinking that if we can meet this goal, like if there's a certain number of people we can reach out to, or maybe if we get to every continent and establish a church there, maybe that will be the conditions under which the timetables will be advanced, and we could usher in Christ's return sooner. Thinking that we can somehow manipulate the way in which God is working and how God is acting in time. And I think there's quite a few problems with that scripturally, in terms of how Jesus talks about that future day, and how the early Christians even kind of conceive of when Christ is returning, thinking about the urgency to which they thought, they are, Paul and them were really believing that it could be any day at their point in time. Yet here we are, 2,000 years later, and we're telling ourselves, well, maybe if we can get everything in order, maybe then we can, coerce God or move God in some kind of way to then return now, since we have him, in the right, we have him nailed down in the right place once we do this certain task.
Now, before we go to our next question, I'm a wordsmith and I always like to key in on words. This idea of exaltation of the Great Commission really sets us up for our next question, because exaltation means that we put something maybe on a pedestal. There's a pedestal culture around certain things. When I think of the Great Commission, it's athletic, it's sexy. We can put it up on stage. We can promote it. We can leverage it. If we're good at it, it can be raised to a level where something else gets missed. And that's where I want to bring up our next question, which is, okay, if this idea of the Great Commission has been inappropriately lifted up, then in what ways is God's big overall mission or vision being missed?
Yeah.
And that's the next question.
Yeah, man. Yeah, absolutely. That language of it can be exalted, or it's really sleek and sexy in the sense, it's so quick and snippy, and trendy, to just say, okay, like you have Go Church, or you have like whatever, Make Disciples Network kind of thing like that, right? And you want to keep it like really quick and to the point, and those things are really appealing, but they can become something that can corrupt our minds and cause us to forget where this is really placed, right? So I think a good way to think about this is Christopher J. Wright writes, again, this is in his book, The Great Story and the Great Commission. Solid read. I would definitely recommend it for people curious about this. But he says, we need the Old Testament scriptures for a full understanding of whatever we think Jesus meant his disciples to be and go and do. And I think that's absolutely the key here is we already have a natural tendency to gravitate towards the New Testament itself. But then if we even go to just one select scripture or passage in the New Testament, we're narrowing ourselves even further, and we're forgetting about that whole broad picture that's leading up to there. Where is God's story in all this if we've reduced it down to some kind of little line that works for whatever kind of agenda that we have, right? So I think that we need to go back to the Old Testament and ask ourselves, what are God's aims and desires for humanity and for creation? I think that grounding ourselves properly on God's grand drama helps us have a better understanding of what mission even is. We have to go back to creation to discover what tov, what good is. We need to re-examine the delight that is Eden, to ponder a world where humans are naked yet unashamed, where harmony is the song of the hour, fellow humans have the best in mind for each other, and creation is following suit with that. This is God's goal for humans, and not just them, but not just them as in humans, but all creation. We know this story takes a twist into a whole mess of rebellion, right? We know that story, how that ideal vision, God's aims, God's desires for humans takes this, this catastrophic turn into this, mess that's on a cosmic level, with sin taking humans captive largely and personally together. Yet, if we go from Genesis to Malachi and we really take a look at the story, right, we're seeing God hatching a plan, which along the whole way is involving persons and people groups he partners with to display the light shining forth from the desires of his heart, right? So I think we need to ground ourselves in that story to recognize, again, what are God's aims for humans and creation? And it's larger than just what is their status between them and God. That's a piece of it, right? Like this forgiveness and this mending a relationship between God and his people. But we have to understand that God doesn't just have hopes for each individual person, but that there's something he's longing for his creation as a whole, for each of us, that's mended and, that's been broken and twisted and mangled. And if we don't fit the Great Commission into that story, I think we can lose sight of what we're doing with the Great Commission. That it becomes more about producing numbers or creating people rather than bringing more people in and upping the size of God's church or advancing the timetables, rather than how are we going back to God's original intention? How are we conquering sin and seeing that the cross of Christ has overcome sin, so that we no longer have to be slaves to lives that are animated by the forces of death in the flesh, but lives that are instead driven by the Spirit, driven by what God wants them, right? So, even though Jesus and his followers didn't use the language of mission, they would have understand God's plans for the cosmos and humanity through the Old Testament scriptures, right? Like, we think of the scriptures and we think of the whole Bible, and we think of the New Testament probably most directly and relatable to us. But for them, they were thinking through the lens of the Old Testament, which is another one of those reasons why we have to engage with it as we are trying to figure out in our minds what is God's mission, what are his aims and desires for his people and for creation, right? If we scrap that text, or we only use the Old Testament as far as it bolsters our blueprint readings of the New Testament, that's going to leave us blind to the real picture of God's desires for humankind. So that's a couple of thoughts. Do you have any?
In what ways might someone who feels called to social justice, like let's say, based off of way that we've conceptualized mission, let's say someone feels in their conscience that there are certain injustices happening, kind of like what you were saying earlier about we live in a very uncomfortable culture. Let's say someone feels called to represent the fatherless, the marginalized, the poor, the widows. My question is would that be considered a distraction from the mission? I guess it depends on how you define the mission. But would that be a social justice rabbit hole, so to speak, at least in terms of what God thinks about them?
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate because I think some of the conversations we have whenever it comes to things like that is, it goes down this route of, okay, like, suddenly we have all this time that we're spending, on social justice activities, we're helping people very tangibly, and it becomes this conversation or question of, well, what, if we really got down to it, what is most important here? And there becomes this mentality of, the focus is on, we got to save souls. Like, ultimately, that's what's going to matter, right? Like, everything else is going to waste away. Like, yeah, they might starve, but if their souls are fed, that's what's most important. And I'm not going to say that isn't important as well, but I think it definitely makes a leap that if you're reading the Old Testament and letting the Old Testament shape your thinking, it's not there. I think that we spend so much time agonizing over, these conversations with people of, where would you go if you died today? And we kind of pose that kind of question with people, and, we're spending all this time and energy kind of agonizing over, where are we going when we die? And that's something the Old Testament texts do not spend much time or content actually covering and discussing in detail. It is so much more focused with the story being on God's covenantal relationship with Israel, to mend relationship with Israel so that they can be a just nation with God's wisdom, so that other nations can see the beauty that comes from Israel whenever they're radiant as a people that is living animated by God's reign. And what that means displaying God's goodness and justice in living out these very tangible acts of those things, right? Like, why is Leviticus there to give all these laws that are advocating for certain peoples that are cast out, that are marginalized? Why do we have the prophets that are constantly berating other nations or Israel itself for their mistreatment of the poor, right? Like, if you read Isaiah 59, it's hard to come away from that and not feel the deep passion that God has for his people to deliver very tangible justice that is concerned about what happens to people's bodies in this time and in this place. Again, it's that time focus that we talked about earlier. It's very focused on what is happening presently, or what happened in the past. Well, in the past, we saw that there was injustice. So in the present, now is the time to repent and to change and to do something now, to take up the cause of those who have been disenfranchised and hurt.
The Old Testament was their lens for how they're thinking about God's mission.
Right.
That's really tough for someone who lives in a westernized sort of aspect of like westernized mindsets. That's hard to grasp.
Yeah. Yeah, totally, man. Yeah, and I think that's I think that the beautiful side of identifying ourselves as disciples is that a disciple is a learner, right? And so we have a lifetime that we can spend learning and engaging with ourselves and knowing where we come from and trying to discover what's shaped us, but then also to learn what has shaped the people that we look up to in the faith from the past, whether it's Peter or Paul or the prophets or Moses. It's going to take a lot of learning to try to figure out, after so much distance, time and space wise, what are they thinking? How is this shaping who they were in their time? And then how do I draw from that to think about how I engage what's shaped me today? But we have a privilege and honor to think about that and realize that, the gospel isn't just primarily about, our forgiveness that we receive from God. That is a very essential part of it, to belong to God's people, to be forgiven and accepted as His children. But that it's also about ministering to the physical and tangible needs of people. That this is essential to what we understand as the good news of God's reign in our lives and in the world.
Let's just establish a precedent for why church history is important, and then we can get to the misunderstanding part. But why is church history important?
Yeah, church history is really important because again, if we don't understand where we come from or where the church has been, then we can fail to see what temptations are out there to grip us. The ways in which the powers and authorities, Satan, sin has tried to grab the church at times and twist it to their own end, which is not good and is devastating for human beings. And it takes a lot of patience to do that, to look at history and to treat it well. It can be really easy to just dismiss what's happened before and look at since in 2,000 years since the time of Jesus is living, to just say, okay, well, ever since Jesus, there just never has been anything like that again. It's just there's, in a sense, yeah, it's not going to be the same as Jesus tangibly being there and the apostles being there, but it also isn't humanizing to engage with the other people in church history and just automatically dismiss them and call them, and say that they are not true Christians in some kind of sense. But we need to think more critically than that and think more critically of ourselves. If we are claiming that we are true disciples, there can be a real danger there. We are not the first. We would not be the first group of people to claim ourselves as the only true Christians in the history of time, either as a large movement or as a small faction. And there are definitely some inherent dangers to trying to take a monopoly on that. But if we don't read and engage with history to see what kind of fruit those things bring, then we will not be able to understand what could be grasping us out.
So now that we've kind of established the importance of it, the need for church history, what is a way that maybe church history is misunderstood?
Yeah, definitely. So I think when it comes to engaging the biblical text itself for a basis of church history, I think with Paul's letters, we have this. If we really engage with Paul's letters, we'll notice that there's kind of this failure that he has to thrust evangelism as the central task of churches. If we're thinking in that lens that what Paul's main interest is creating converts and churches that multiply, disciples making disciples making disciples. You'll notice reading through the letters that that's not his primary concern. He does talk a lot about the task that he was given as an apostle to bring the good news of God's reign to the Gentiles. But we take a hermeneutical leap in a way whenever we go ahead and take all those texts where he's speaking of his own bold actions and his special calling and apply it to ourselves. But even if we were to take those texts as they were and we start looking through what is he very directly and explicitly talking to churches about, in terms of what does he want them to be as a community. There's so much more than that. So many other facets. It's about all these intimate details of life. What it is that they do with their bodies, what it is that they do when they're out in in the pagan world around them. What is it whenever they come into situations where they have legal disagreements with each other? I think there's a really interesting text in 1 Corinthians 11 where Paul in a passage where he actually talks about proclaiming proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes is talking about the feast. It's talking about the Lord's Supper. He's trying to tell them that whenever they gather and they eat the Lord's Supper properly, which in this context means the rich aren't showing up before the poor, so they can just party it up all together, exclude the others because they're not like them, and revel in the indulgences they can afford. But instead, whenever they welcome everyone together in Christ as one family, and they do that kind of justice to one another, that act of eating in such a way is what is proclaiming the Lord's death. That our embodiment of the gospel as a community and how we relate to each other is more essential for the church in the weight of Paul's teachings and letters than just okay, we've got to go out and speak and just make as many people as possible be exposed to our verbal message and our ideas.
But in terms of the New Testament, let's just take the New Testament. If you are on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and they asked you to come up with more than 15 or 20 New Testament imperatives to evangelize, would you be able to share 15 or 20 scriptures?
If I'm actually taking the context into account of a picture of imperative commands that are meant for that seem to be directed at all disciples of Christ for all time, I don't think I could come up with that many.
Wow.
I think that as you get into it, like there are some that it could be implicitly derived that maybe that's what he's encouraging them to do, or there's ones that are more explicit, like in Colossians 4 verses 5 and 6. He talks about their kind of being ready to respond when asked about their faith, and I think that what's going on there even is still this connection to they are living a particular way as a community. And of course, if they're living a way as a particular community, they're going to ask questions if they're doing something that is outside the norm of the culture that they're in. Like, things are going to happen, conversations are going to be there. And yes, those are opportunities to talk and discuss it and try to articulate what it is that has formed you and your community in those patterns. But it seems to me that trying to weigh out the text across the New Testament in general, that they aren't really leaning towards this push for multiplication or creating some kind of systematic way of doing that. And I think that's one of the real keys, is there's not really this kind of instruction manual approach. Like, they don't take that kind of idea of how do we formalize this? How do we make this something that is really accessible very quickly for as many people as possible, and how can we hand down a really straightforward way of doing this that does not seem to be of the utmost concern to them. Otherwise, it would be much clearer.
That day of Pentecost, 3,000 people, I think that has been etched in people's minds as that's not only what's possible, but that's what God has planned to do, even though that's the only time we see it. In Acts 2 is the only time we see that many people and that type of emphasis on baptism. And I wonder if in Acts 2, yes, it was about people getting converted, but I wonder if there's another contextual factor going on in Acts 2 when we look at the response of the crowd, that 3,000 people got baptized, and the way that in some ways has been leveraged, right, to tack on to Matthew 28, right? So we start with Matthew 28, but then we follow it up with Acts 2, which has 3,000 people responding to Peter's message. But then if you go down, it says those who accepted the message were baptized. So that type of incredible watershed moment, right? New creation breaking in. Maybe there's some other contextual aspects going on there that maybe we haven't been privy to per se.
Oh yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, I think situating that moment in God's story is really crucial, and noting too, this is like the kickoff of God's church. This is a really important moment in history following
Hmm.
the ascension of Christ. And I think we can take from that, yeah, God does do incredible things. But I think looking at that moment and saying, what can we do to generate or replicate that moment? Um, it's going to lead to some real disappointment and frustration, because I do not think that that's a moment in time that necessarily we should all be reflected to make that same moment happen again. Nor do
Hmm.
we see, again, like you just said, as you read the book of Acts, that doesn't happen in that kind of capacity again. And you don't see, Paul and Peter and them agonizing like, guys, why can't we repeat what happened at Pentecost? Like, why can't we make that happen again? I mean, if you're thinking about how they engaged with what God was doing in the world and the early church, they aren't thinking about how can we manipulate the results into happening? How can we make God move? Their posture towards God in this kind of way is, if we live faithfully to Him, if we are obedient and patient, He will work in His
Hmm.
own timing. That it's just kind of that mindset, where Paul talks about, I might water, but it's God who makes the plant grow. And that's the heart of what they took on was, God's going to make this plant grow in time. That be it. But furthermore, there's just a challenge with if we are going to look at Acts and say, okay, everything that the disciples or apostles were and did, that's what we need to be and do now. We're very selective in reality about how we apply that. Particularly in our churches, I don't see too many people, working on their spiritual warfare in terms of casting out demons and things of that nature. There are ways that we are drawing those lines, or trying to discern what was for them and what was for us, and it can lead to some really tricky topics. I'm sure many of us would not want to have to get into.
Let me ask you one quick question. Uh, okay, so early church history evangelism, first,
Mhm.
second, third, whatever, fourth centuries. What was the
Yeah.
priority or emphasis of evangelism in the early church history?
Yeah, in early church history, I would say that well, they didn't have any treatises or writings that are specifically laying out evangelism. That
Hmm.
wasn't one of their focal points, or a topic that was of vast importance to them. Rather, I think patience would be a value that they were very keen on adopting and keeping and maintaining, in the spirit in what they were doing. So Alan Kreider's written about this pretty extensively in The Patient Ferment of the Early Church, where you can read through a lot of what these early church fathers say about the posture of their communities and how they direct people as they do. They are bringing new people into the community. They are growing over those first few centuries, but they had a very patient posture towards it, where they weren't focused as much as how can we get in as many people as possible, as how can we bring people in who genuinely want to obey and make Jesus their Lord. I mean, they would take 2 or 3 years for someone to be baptized. They were not
Hmm.
interested in systematizing a way of people becoming disciples as much as they were going through the depth of relationship, and through the preservation of a community that is just and oriented towards peace. They're going to take a while for new people to be formed into that, because they're very concerned about how they themselves were formed as disciples of Jesus and how that had impacted the whole of their lives. So I think what happens in history, though, is you get to Constantine and things really change a lot. If you don't know much about Constantine, Constantine had been introduced to Christians throughout his life as an emperor, in Rome, and it was around 312 A.D. when he had this experience where he saw the image of a cross in the sky and he heard the words, "In this thine conquest." And shortly after that, he had a military victory that decidedly gave him power over the western part of the Roman Empire. And so after that, he always claimed a Christian identity and then spent the next 31 years of his reign securing the church's position in society and really transforming what mission even meant to Christians, or at least setting up structures that would transform what mission meant for Christians. So I think to kind of list out some of these fundamental differences that produced in the Christian community following Constantine was one that he used control, whereas the previous Christians would consistently throughout their writings say, we will not use manipulation or force of any kind to coerce or persuade people to join us. Or rather, their emphasis is all on, we are going to display our lives this way, we'll speak the truth, and if people walk away, they will walk away. That is completely fine with us. But Constantine was all about strategy. It was about how can we make a plan such that people will not be able to refuse this. So they will see that this is the right way, and we'll have convincing methods of which to persuade them, whether they like it or not, that this is the right way. And ultimately becomes this mindset of the ends justify the means. Whatever it takes to get there, that is now acceptable because God's mission must be accomplished, and we are his people on task to do so. And so along with that, he started giving benefits to those in need, but conditionally, only if they would become Christians, whereas the Christian community previously, in the face of famines or illnesses that were widespread, they would give to anyone who had need. They didn't have this kind of distinction of, okay, well, we'll give you something as long as you show up to this particular event, or as long as you become one of us. But it was this task of, we are going to go and be generous to people regardless of what they give us, because this is what God has tasked us with, to be generous people. I think also Constantine really introduced this idea of crushing opposition. Heretics earlier on in the church would be, of course, they would be taught, they would not be unnoticed or disregarded. They would definitely be refuted. But those people would be very much tolerated in the community, as much as, they're still being people who are loved and in relationship with. Whereas Constantine started this process of exiling and punishing those who thought differently or presented different ways of thinking. And then lastly, and this kind of runs in line with everything that was said, is that speed became of most value. And in trying to make things expedient, he established church liturgies at a political level. He established different kinds of catechesis, the way they study the Bible back then, and to introduce new people to the faith, that he made a formal way of doing that to make things more efficient and more quick, to produce more results in less time. So I think that just shows for us that, we have to consider for ourselves, do we take up some of those impulses that Constantine had? Or are we taking a different posture? Are we focused more on speed and efficiency and whatever means it takes to produce the supreme end of bringing souls to Christ? What are we doing to achieve that? And is it something that is actually disowning our call to be disciples of Christ because we want to meet some kind of end?
Wow. We're gonna do a part 2 at some point, bro. I've got you. Man, I'm so grateful that you're in the community, and I there's some stuff we got to talk about. I'm gonna have you back, man. Let's just for a moment. I should have had you open up with a little bit about you. Let's talk about you for a moment as we get ready to close up. You're a serious Bible student. You're a teacher, man. You're in the weeds. Tell us a little bit about what your hope is for the future when it comes to biblical studies and so forth.
Yeah, totally, man. I love getting into it, man. And I really enjoyed this opportunity with the literacy team here with Patreon and helping out with we have a teaching team we've tried to put together here in Jacksonville. And
Mhm.
I mean, right now I don't have any kind of the formal education. It's just become something that's just so central to my life. I'd maybe love to do that one day, seeing how the circumstances of life work out. But I think when it comes to this particular topic, when we're talking about mission and evangelism, and thinking about what's a path forward, right? Like I've laid out some observations here. I guess my three central observations again, are that we can exalt the Great Commission and make that the center of all that mission is, or we can miss the big picture of God's mission, not centering the Great Commission within the story of God and what his aims are on the whole. And then lastly, by disregarding church history and not thinking about what's happened before. So I think these are just some thoughts on a path forward. I think that one of the things we need to do is follow the impulse. There was this guy, Roland Allen, who was a missionary back in 1913. And he spoke against using a command, the Great Commission specifically, to drive the mission. He said that instead, it should be the Spirit that is creating an inward disposition to action. And I think that this is really important that, I've got to consider myself, and I think we do as a community, are we taking the Great Commission and trying to create a manufacturing process instead of cultivating a farm, or it's kind of this idea of difference between, you have a blueprint where everything has to match up perfectly. It all has to be according to the print, exactly as it is pictured. Or you have the idea of a terrace. A terrace gives structure to a plant, but it allows the plant to organically grow. And I think that's something that I need to take on, others need to take on, is thinking about, okay, we do need some kind of structure, but how can we be guided by the Spirit and not become a slave to our systems and structures that we put in place? Yeah, so some last thoughts here. I'll
Sure.
try to keep this brief. I think we have to ask ourselves, if we're so focused on making disciples, I think first we need to ask ourselves, what kind of disciples are we? If we're making disciples like ourselves, what kind of disciples are we? Have we done the reflection to look at ourselves and realize, who are we as disciples? Have we really reflected on where we're at and what kind of people we're making? If we ourselves are still some pretty broken people as a community, maybe we need to think a little bit more before just bringing in more people, right? I don't want to become like the Pharisees, who would travel so far to win a single convert only for them to become twice the son of hell they were. I don't want to end up to be like them, so I need to do reflection on that. I think that a constructive vision for the church's role and mission is to embody the gospel by being a living temple, by being the new creation, and by conforming to the cross, by being animated by the nature of the cross, which is serving and self-sacrifice, rather than Constantine, who is shaped by control and coercion and force. I think we need to practice the gospel by having attractive lives worthy of the gospel, worship, and contributions to support the wider Christian community. And I think lastly, we need to narrate the gospel by responding to the inquiries we hear about our lives, about our gospel embodiment and practice. And I think if we try to engage with those things and have the imagination to think through different ways that could look like now and give the freedom to live that out in different ways, I think there is a hopeful future for how we think of God's mission now in our time.
Well, I feel convicted, and I also feel a sense of freedom. This conversation, and I think a lot of folks feel this way, likely. We don't mind changing our mind on certain things. It just depends on how radical the shift is, number one. But number two, if someone can state to us through scripture, or the way that we're looking at scripture is limiting or underdeveloped, then I find that a lot of people want to grow. They want to shift. They want to change. It is uncomfortable to think, wow, this thing that I've believed, I could see some people losing motivation because the
Mhm.
structure gives them a way to structure a lot of people's gifting and their talents and their passion. It gives them a way to channel that. And without it, some people lose motivation.
I find that it makes much more sense of the holistic life of what it means to be a disciple. I think part of, for me, of what it really hits home with this study and getting into this topic is that as I graduated college, where it was our focus was very much on making disciples, and it's a transition of life being in college, and I understand the emphasis on doing such a thing, but such an emphasis led to when I graduated or I saw my friends graduating, or I was talking to people at different stages in life, they were having a hard time reconciling, being a working person, this 40-hour a week job, and being a disciple. If
Mm,
it is reduced down to
mm,
how can I just produce more and make more disciples, your job is just a platform for that, rather than it is the work itself that you're doing at your job, the good
mm,
that you can do in that, the good that you do as a parent at home, and what you're doing to nurture your children, what you're doing as a friend when you're there present for someone in grief. All these different things are contributing to what it means to be a spirit-filled community. And I think whenever we are those kind of people, yes, I think God's spirit works in and among us, and it will shine out to the community. I think other people will see that, and I think other people will be drawn to it, rather than us just going out and delivering a message and telling people to come in, only for them to get to a different phase of life where that's no longer a sufficient story.
Well, brother, I am grateful for the time that you have invested in this conversation, preparing for it. You've done excellent research, excellent, top-notch research on this. I feel edified, and I am also I respect you because you got a little one. You just had a baby. I mean, you're not not just, but not that long ago. So you're a new father. You got a lot going on. You got a big boy job. I mean, like you have a life, and yet you still make time for this, and that means the world to me. Let me tell you what I tell all folks is, we are with you, and God is for you, my brother. Bless you for coming on and helping us today.
Thank you, Kyle.
Absolutely. Well, if you're interested in joining Patreon and potentially joining one of our teams, you can come on Patreon. We'll have a conversation and see if it's a good fit for you. I hope this conversation was edifying for you as well. I'll see you next time.